But your expert of the week this week is Julian from the University of Nottingham. He's an astronomer. And each week around this time I introduce you to a new expert. And tonight we're talking space. Lots to talk about. If you have any questions that you'd like to put to Julian, then by all means get in touch using the numbers I'm about to reiterate. Because I should introduce first your expert of the week. It's Julian, who's an astronomer from the University of Nottingham. Good to have you here.
Oh, good to be here. Thank you, Dean.
Now, we're fascinated by space here. Obviously, I'm in this box, so I don't get to see out on a Friday night. But one of the most exciting things that goes on is when the International Space Station comes over.
Yes.
Because I'm a big fan of it when I'm not here. So I'll mention it, and people from all over the region rush out to see it.
Oh, yes, I love to see it too. I try and take photos if I can.
How do you do that, then? Because presumably you need a really good camera to do it, don't you?
Well, you need one that you can leave the shutter open for about 20 or 30 seconds and a tripod to position it, and then you just got to point it in the right direction and hope you catch it.
So you get a streak.
You get a streak across it, and yes, and while that's going on you can wave to the people on the space station.
Is it possible, maybe during daylight hours, I guess, really, that from Earth to get a picture of it, or is it simply too far away for a camera on Earth to capture any level of detail?
During the day it's really quite hard because it's so bright, but some people, very clever people, have got telescopes that will track it because it's moving really quite fast if you've seen it. And some people have really got some of the detail. You can see the solar panels and the different modules. It's a really quite tricky thing to do because it's moving so fast. You've got to line it up and you only get one shot, and then it's gone for an hour and a quarter or so before it comes round again.
So it's going around constantly, of course it is.
Yes.
I mean, we know that, but it takes about an hour and a quarter to
yeah, I think so.
What is in layman's terms, what is the reason that we only see it at certain times? I've just been looking for the next time. It's the 8th of October. Now, presumably that's just the next time it's visible to us, isn't it?
Yes. Well, it's got to be moving over the UK, first of all. And the other crucial thing is the sunlight has got to hit it, and it's only, 200-300 kilometres up, something like that. It's not very far in terms of how far you could drive, so it will quickly go into the Earth's shadow. So the conditions have to be just right for the sun to hit it, and you see the glint of it. And now it's got so many modules and bits attached to it, it's really, as you say, very bright. Brighter than most stars.
Isn't there talk of a new rocket to get astronauts up to it at the moment?
Well, there is, yes, there's quite a bit of talk about new rockets. At the moment the Americans can't launch crew into space. They have to rely on the Russian space rockets, but there's quite a lot of other contenders now. I mean, India's just launched a probe to Mars. China managed to land a probe on the moon, so it's sort of all to play for now.
There's always talk of these trips to Mars, and I suppose that after the landing on the moon, that's the next holy grail, isn't it, in terms of getting people on Mars? Will it happen in our lifetime?
Oh, I do hope so, but I don't know. The dates keep seeming to drift further and further. I mean, when I was younger, I was thinking, yes, it's only going to be a few years away, but now they're talking 2030, 2040 maybe.
And how long would it take someone to get there from the moment they blasted off from Earth, roughly speaking?
Roughly speaking, it's about 9 months to get there, and you can only do it certain times because the two planets move around, and it's only when they're fairly close together that it's worth making a attempt. Otherwise it would just take far too long.
The majority of the questions that are coming through on the email are to do with comets. They seem to be in the public psyche at the moment, so can I just run one or two of these past you if that's okay? Sure. There's talk of landing on a comet at the moment. That's been in the news a fair bit, and it seems to be really big news. Two things, two strands coming in here from people. One is, why such big news? And the other one is, how on earth, because comets are moving pretty fast, do you go about landing on a comet?
Well, it's certainly not been an easy task. It's taken, I think it's about 10 years to get this spaceship into the right place. So it's had to go past the Earth a couple of times, past, I think, Mars and Venus, to pick up enough power to shoot out to the outer solar system, and then come back in trailing this comet and gradually catch up with it, because the amount of rocket fuel you can obviously launch into space is quite limited, so you have to pick your time and your position quite carefully. And then they've now got close into sort of almost into orbit around it. But it's so small, it's only a couple of kilometres across, I think, something like that. It really doesn't have very much gravity, so in orbit, it's not really in orbit. You have to keep making adjustments with little rocket motors to keep it positioned around it. And then, of course, the lander, that's going to be even more interesting. Somebody described it as sort of throwing a parcel out of a jumbo jet and trying to hit a centre spot on a football pitch or something like that. And there is, as I said, there's very little gravity, so it's sort of going to just drift down, and once it hits the initial thing, it would just bounce off, but it's got these sort of little screws in its legs, so it lands and then quickly screws itself onto the comet to hold itself in position so it can do its science package from there.
What's it going to do?
Well, it's mostly looking at the constituents of the comet. There's a lot of interest in what they're made up of, because there's a couple of theories about how we got all the water on the Earth, and one of them is perhaps it all came from comets. And by doing very careful scientific measurements of the exact constituents of the water, you can make a reasonable guess, say, well, it looks very much like water does on Earth, and if that's the case, then maybe it was comets that brought it.
So a lot of comets.
It would have been a lot of comets, and it would have been early on, yes, but after the Earth had cooled.
The other question, this is from Glenn, who's listening in Derby City Centre tonight, and there have been many other people asking the same sort of question, and they're pointing out that at the beginning of the year, when the news programmes were looking forward to 2014, they said there was talk of maybe two comets that we would be able to see with the naked eye during the course of the year.
Yeah.
And Glenn and others were greatly looking forward to that, and it doesn't seem to have happened, and there aren't many more weeks of 2014 left for it to happen.
No, well, there's nothing really around at the moment. This comet that is being visited really isn't a naked eye object. There was one around very end of last year, 2013, just coming up to Christmas. I did actually manage to get a photo of it from my upstairs window.
Really?
And having seen where it was, I even kidded myself I could actually see it, but it was very, very faint. But then it then moved on around the sun, and everybody hoped that it would go round the sun and sort of balloon up and become much more visible. But actually it came round the sun and just broke up. It came too close to the sun, a bit like Icarus came too close, broke up.
That's a pity.
It is.
So that was probably, I guess, one of the better chances that in recent decades of seeing it.
Well, yeah, there's a couple in the 90s, but yeah, recent times that was one a lot of people were pinning their hopes on.
So for Glenn and people like Glenn who are hoping to see a comet one day, how far ahead can we predict that there will be one visible to the naked eye?
Probably a year or two, but it's very difficult to work out how visible they are. It depends how much sunlight they absorb, what they're made of, and how much gas they give off, because the more gas they give off, the sort of brighter it becomes.
So there's nothing in the diary at the moment?
Nothing. There's one or two around, but that may just come brightish.
Okay.
But
too early to say.
Too early to say, really.
Right, your expert of the week this week is Julian Onions. He's an astronomer from the University of Nottingham. If you have any space-related questions, do feel free to put them to Julian now. The number to dial 0370. Your guest this evening is Julian Onions, an astronomer from the University of Nottingham. If you do have any questions for Julian. Some great questions coming in, though, Julian. This is from Bill, who's listening tonight, or I guess this afternoon there, in Florida. He said, how do you go about coping with space junk when you're launching something into outer space?
Yeah.
Is that a huge problem now?
That is a really huge problem. Look, there's a lot of junk floating around in space, and most of it is moving at about 17,000 miles an hour. So it's not something you want to run into. So obviously they plan for this, and it's perhaps more important that there's a lot of satellites orbiting the Earth that cost a lot of money to get up there, and they don't want those running into either. There was interesting development, so there's a lot of stuff being tracked, but the Chinese a few years ago tested a sort of anti-satellite weapon and launched something up that destroyed an old satellite, but it blasted it into smithereens.
Right.
And that sort of doubled overnight the amount of junk that was floating around that had to be avoided and tracked.
And I suppose when something's travelling at 17,000 miles per hour, it doesn't need to be very big to inflict some serious damage, does it, really?
That's true. I mean, sometimes they have to move the space station up or down a bit if they think there's a chance it will get hit. Even a small screw or a bolt or something like that, moving at that sort of speed.
They can track that, can't they?
I think there's obviously a limit to how small it can go.
Yeah.
But they're even talking about flecks of paint and what that would do.
That's incredible. So somebody somewhere is sitting saying up a bit, down a bit for the International Space Station.
Well, yeah, I think they mostly do it for the big bits. It's reasonably well protected because there's other things that you can't account for, like mini meteorites that occasionally hit it.
And they do hit it, do they?
Yes, they just come out of the blue sort of thing, or out of the black, in fact, and they will just impact it.
So an astronaut sitting there having a cup of whatever they drink in outer space, and so there's a thud, and it's something... That's quite unnerving.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like a little ping. They can sometimes hear it inside, and that could be worrying, I would think.
Now, Pluto is back on the agenda again.
Yes.
A number of years ago, it was demoted from being a planet, so all of those mnemonics that we learnt at school, for remembering the planets in order from the sun...
Those that ended with P, yes.
They're all redundant now. But there might be news here, maybe.
Well, yeah, there's been a bit of discussion about exactly what the definition of a planet is, and there's a lot of people who strongly feel in their heart that Pluto should return to planethood. So it seems to come up every couple of years that people will try and get it back into the list of planets. But I really don't think it's going to happen. Since Pluto was discovered, and it was discovered in about 1930s, it wasn't as big as people hoped it would be when they were looking for this sort of ninth planet. And when they did find it, it's in a very eccentric orbit. It sometimes comes in closer than Neptune and then goes out further. And it's not even aligned with all the other planets. It's sort of tilted at an angle.
Okay.
And then in early 2000, Mike Brown at Caltech, he did a big survey of the outer solar system, which is really hard because you're looking for these very tiny little things that are moving against the background. And he found firstly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then even something bigger than Pluto that was moving around there. So it's a tricky one to say, well, if you're going to reinstate Pluto as a planet, then really you ought to take those back in as well.
Bring the others on board.
Yeah,
yes. And
then there's some bigger things in the asteroid belt that are also much the same size as Pluto, so they ought to come into the family, and before long, our mnemonic for listing out the planets will be go over a couple of pages or something like that.
Okay, so it could happen, but it's a bit unlikely.
It's probably a bit unlikely.
I remember when it was demoted from being a planet, watching the convention, there were people sobbing about it, being a planet.
It really seems to get to people. It's just cultural definition of what a planet is.
This is an interesting one. This is coming from lots of people. I don't think it's particularly relevant at the moment, but there has been talk throughout this year of supermoons.
Oh yes,
it's been mentioned a lot, and it's a phrase that seems to have almost come into parlance in the past 2 years. Presumably there have always been supermoons. We've just started calling them supermoons. And how often do they come round? Says Reg, who's listening in Birmingham.
I don't know actually. I think they every few months or something like that. It's not a particularly odd occasion, and really they're not that much super. It's just the moon is on a very slightly elliptical orbit, so sometimes we see it a little closer, sometimes it's a little further away, but the difference is absolutely minute. I have seen photographs positioned next to each other, and you can sort of look, if you overlap the two, that there is a difference, but it's really minor.
It strikes me as it's something that's been born almost through Facebook, because there's a report that the moon's going to be a bit nearer, and suddenly these groups spring up and people are sharing this information as though it's suddenly leapt sort of hundreds of miles closer to Earth, and that's hardly the case, is it really? It
really isn't, and they're not particularly super. There's another one that goes around occasionally, that Mars is going to be visible at the same size as the moon, and that's just never going to happen. It's far too far away. It's never going to be more than a pinprick in the sky.
Well, which is a shame in a way.
Yeah, it would be nice to see it and make it a lot easier to get to too.
Yeah, absolutely. Julian, thank you so much for calling in tonight. It's been a pleasure to have you, and a huge response as well. And as you drive away, there'll be even more coming in, because that's what happens every week. Okay. So maybe we can twist your arm to come back sometime in the future.
Maybe, yes.
Okay, all right.